I want to go through a brief introduction to Gnosticism because Gnosticism is one of the worldviews that is frequently the backdrop to science fiction, and you know whether it be on film or in television shows, uh, books, whatever. Gnosticism or threads of it, little sort of breadcrumbs of it, will often be scattered through films. In some cases, films like The Matrix really heavily draw on Gnosticism. That isn't the only thing The Matrix draws on, but that's an example of something where Gnosticism is really, really important to the film. But in other cases, it's just going to be a snippet here, a snippet there, sort of a thought stream here or there. But I want you to be able to follow discussion on the podcast when we get into Gnosticism. If you don't know what it is, or maybe even if you think you know what it is, you still ought to watch this introduction. So here we go. Just a brief summary, and I'm going to try to go reasonably quickly. What does Gnosticism seek to provide? What spiritual help does it offer? It is a worldview, it is a faith, it is a religion. The information that I'm going to go through really is a distillation of points in this book, Gnosticism, by Stephan Heller. Heller is a Gnostic bishop, and he is the force behind the website gnosis.org. So I wanted to get the information about Gnosticism right from the horse's mouth, so to speak, so that you know it's not a caricature. I'm not giving you something that a fundamentalist Christian, Orthodox Christian would say about Gnosticism to sort of tar and feather it. I want you to know what Gnostics believe. So, by way of summary, Gnosticism is the teaching based on gnosis. That's where the term comes from, Gnosticism, gnosis, which is the knowledge of transcendence, and it's arrived at by way of intuition, by way of an interior intuitive means. It's not something that you can sort of learn. Because Gnosticism is really talking about an awakening. Now you can learn things that contribute to an awakening, but an awakening for a Gnostic is really something that happens internally. Teaching is going to be important, but ultimately you have to come to certain understandings on your own. So knowing God for a Gnostic is not about knowing an external being in a personal relationship like, biblical Christianity would articulate. And it's also not achieved, again, totally by external revelation like a Bible or something like that. The means is internal. It requires an awakening, and that can come from just about anything. Again, something you hear somebody say, something you see, some symbol, an experience, whatever. All of these things can contribute to gnosis, your personal awakening. Now that suggests that there's something we don't know that needs to be known. There's something we need to be awakened to. Okay? And that something is Gnosticism's story, the realization of which, the awakening of which, is what produces salvation in a Gnostic sense. And we'll talk about what that is and what that means in a moment. Gnosticism fundamentally recognizes a few things. This is not going to sound revelatory, but the way Gnosticism sort of addresses these things is quite different. Earthly life is filled with suffering. Again, we all know that. All forms of life consume each other, and then you have pain and fear and death, on up the food chain, the whole evolutionary span of the history of life and all that sort of thing. And life as we experience it too, it's filled with suffering. Natural catastrophes bring suffering and death. Something just isn't right about the world, because the world has this in it, has these things in it that cause suffering and really amplify it. So there's something not right about the world. Now, many religions advocate that humans are to be blamed for the imperfections of the world. If you think about your traditional Judaism or Christianity, there's this idea of a fall. Adam and Eve fall in the Garden of Eden, and not only do they suffer the effects of it, they're driven out, they lose their immortality, they're sinners, they're separated from God not only that, but the earth is cursed because of what happens in Eden. And so the bad things about the earth and about life are ultimately attributable to what Adam and Eve do. It's their fault. It's the fault of humanity. Now, Gnosticism rejects this idea. It argues that the blame for the world's failings does not lie with humans, but with the Creator. Okay, so that's a different idea that we'll return to in a moment. Let's look at Gnostic cosmology. We need to sort of get the bigger picture of what a Gnostic thinks is behind reality as we know it before we sort of return to our discussion about the Creator and the reason the world is bad. So we need to back up a little bit and talk about how a Gnostic views the ultimate beginning and the thing they call the true God. Now, again, I have a circle here. Just try to imagine a oneness, a completeness to this true God. The true God was pre-existent in Gnosticism. The true God is uncaused. The true God is perfect being and is often referred to as the light. Now that's going to sound very similar to the way the New Testament, for instance, talks about God. But as we'll see, there's going to be some serious points of disconnection. Now, the true God to a Gnostic has male and female aspects. Even that's not foreign to a traditional Judeo-Christian view of the world of the Bible, especially the Old Testament. There is feminine language attributed to God. God does create humanity male and female, so without thinking that God has biology, there's some sort of in some way he knows both male and female attributes. So there are male and female aspects in the God of the Bible, like traditional Jews or Christians would think of them. But for the Gnostic, talking about the quote-unquote true God, the true God has male and female aspects. And again, pre-existent, uncaused, all that sort of thing. Now, the male and female aspects are not a god and goddess. Okay, we don't have any sort of polytheistic true God in Gnosticism. Again, we have other things that some people might look at and think of it that way, but the Gnostics certainly did not. But there are nevertheless male and female aspects. And the reason why a Gnostic would think this is because the true God is going to, in Gnostic cosmology, produce things, produce entities, produce divine offspring, as it were, from itself. And we know that to do that, you have to have male and female, at least ordinarily. And so a Gnostic would imagine the true God as having these aspects, and that helps, quote unquote, explain the notion that the true God brings forth from itself or himself emanations, sort of parts of his own being. So the true God brings forth emanations, which I'm going to differentiate by color, because emanations are thought to as well, because they come from the true God. Some of them could be masculine in orientation, others would be feminine. But they are all emanations. And the emanations are also called aeons in Gnosticism. The aeons collectively together are referred to in Gnosticism as the pleroma, the fullness. Okay? So the idea is that the true God, and again, some versions of Gnosticism disagree. There is no one version of Gnosticism. It's actually got a variety of Gnostic theologies, just like today we have a variety of Christianities, even a variety of Judaisms. To a Gnostic, some would say, well, the true God sort of blew himself apart and the pieces became these aeons, and then collectively together, if they were rejoined, they would form the true God. Others would say, well, the true God is still out there, and these emanations are part of him, and so again, collectively in that sense, the pleroma, the fullness, would represent all that the true God is. Now, if we can think of our emanations, our aeons, as male and female, of course, spawned by the true God, we need to add some other things. Now, the dividing line, there is a dividing line in Gnostic cosmology between the realm of these beings, sort of where they belong, where they are naturally from, where they naturally are, and heaven and earth, as we know it, the created universe and material world that we know. Now that world, again, the heaven and earth that we know, does not exist at the point when the true God produces the aeons. This is going to come a little bit later. Now one of the aeons, one of the feminine ones, who is going to be called Sophia, and she's often talked about in terms of a personification, a woman with red hair, for various reasons that, have to do with how Gnosticism played out in different groups on earth, different religious groups, but we'll just go with it for now. Sophia looks at the true God and says, well, this is wonderful. The true God is created us and created all these eons for himself, and we are him and he is us, and all that sort of thing. And she gets it in her head that I would like to do some creating myself. I'd like to create as well. I want to mimic the true God's behavior. I want to be a creator. I want to be like him. And so she sort of transgresses the boundary line between what aeons are supposed to do and decides to, on her own, she doesn't have a partner, a male partner, she decides to create a being that becomes known as the demiurge, or the maker. Now you might say, well, that sounds kind of weird. What maker of what? Well, we'll see here. So over here we have our true gods, our aeons. Sophia has sort of left the group, left the farm, as it were, decides to create on her own. Now the other aeons just were sort of appalled by this idea. She didn't have permission from the true God to do this. And if you're going to do this, you need a consort, you need a partner. And what in the world are you doing? And of course her defense is that I want to be like my maker, like the true God. So she creates this being, again, thinking that this is a good thing to do. This is part of her nature. And this being in turn, the reason he's called the demiurge, or the maker, is because this being creates the earth. This being right here, the demiurge, the maker, is the creator of the Bible, the God of the Bible, to a Gnostic. This God up here is not. This God is transcendent and removed from anything going on over here. And this God, even though he's spoken of in personal terms, is not sort of a personal entity, because again, depending on which Gnosticism you're following, this presence, this essence, this spirit, this light, either blew itself up to create the eons, or again is just out there somewhere in the universe or some other universe, and has really no direct connection to our earth, heaven and earth as we know it. The God of the Bible is this guy right here, to a Gnostic. And this guy is not a good guy. Again, the Gnostic wants to explain why there's evil and suffering on the earth, and their answer to this is the way the Maker made it. Now, the Maker is sort of a rebel and has a mind of his own as well. So he decides, I'm going to create the earth. Why? Because I want something to run. I want something to have power over. And so he creates the earth, and then he also creates helpers. And I have the helpers portrayed as bad guys. Stop. 3, 2, 1. Wait a minute. Stop. 3, 2, 1. He creates helpers. And I have the helpers here created as bad guys because they are. Now these in Gnostic cosmology are referred to as the archons, or the archons. This is a term that shows up in the New Testament for the powers of darkness, principalities, powers, rulers, all that sort of thing. That's what archon means, ruler. And it's a word that shows up in the Greek New Testament. These are the helpers to the demiurge in the Gnostic cosmology. And they're bad guys too, because they're, sort of as sinister as their maker is. They're here to essentially make life bad for humanity, because that's the next thing that the demiurge decides to do. Together, collectively with his archons, either they're helping him or they just observe, he creates humankind. So again, this figure here is the God of the Bible in Gnosticism. And he creates humanity to be nothing more than a race of slaves for his own bidding, and of course the bidding of the archons who are assisting him. Again, if you're familiar at all with certain science fiction pictures and ancient astronaut theory, this is it. I mean, this is Gnosticism applied to Mesopotamian texts. The Anunnaki is essentially where Zechariah Sitchin creates his own mythology that is very popular within ancient astronaut circles. It's just swarmed over Gnosticism. But anyway, what you have here is, this is how the Gnostic views the world. Okay, the Maker made us. There's evil and suffering because that's just the way he made it. He made us to be slaves, and he made henchmen, again, to help him keep us enslaved and, do his bidding and whatnot. He's just a bad guy. The Creator is just a bad guy. Now, Sophia is looking at all this happening and is appalled. This was not her idea. This is not how she saw things turning out. And she pities the humans. She pities humanity and thinks, well, what can I do? I've got to do something to help them. And so what she decides to do is to plant a little bit of herself in humanity, a little bit of her divinity, because her divinity comes from the true God. She is part of the true God. So she puts a little spark of divinity into humanity. Why? Well, her hope is that little spark within this body, otherwise it would have just been sort of a mindless robotic slave. She's hoping that this little spark of divinity will somehow awaken within each human, and each human will realize that within themselves there is a little spark, there's a little bit of the essence of the true God up here. That humanity, she wants each human to realize that in some way each of us is divine. Okay, now if you're thinking, well, this just sounds like New Age stuff from Deepak Chopra or Oprah, you're right. It's the same sort of thing, but we're not through yet. Dualism or monism. Now, what I just described for you sounds quite dualistic. That our world is sort of the again, the product of the Maker, and really, again, all of that is sort of separated from the true God and really shouldn't even exist. And so we get this, that before the Maker was made, everything was good because it comes from the true God, and now we've got this other thing going on here. It really feels like there's a good-evil dualism, and also that reality as we know it comes from two separate sources, that there's the true God and then there's the demiurge. Well, many Gnostics, especially the Valentinians, taught that wasn't the case. Gnosticism is really, when you get right down to it, monistic. All is one. And they taught that how they get there is this way: that the creation of our material world by the demiurge was an illusion deriving from our own misperceptions of the true God. So as we would look at the Gnostic story, in our minds we think it's dualistic because we can't see beyond our own Maker. We can't see beyond the demiurge. And so because we misperceive the fact that there's really a God beyond the God of the Bible, things look dualistic, but it's actually monistic, because none of this would exist. Even though Sophia screwed up, none of reality as we know it would exist had it not been for the true God creating aeons. And therefore everything that does exist in some way comes ultimately from the same source, and that source is the true God. And so reality is actually monistic. All is one. There is no actual distinction between the world, the created world we know, and the true God in terms of how it originated. Everything is one, all is one. Again, the concept's a little difficult perhaps to understand. Again, but a Gnostic would say, well, that's because you're deceived. You don't really see what the ultimate reality is. Most people think the ultimate reality is, heaven and earth and all this sort of stuff, and we never get to really see who we are and where we ultimately came from. And not only us, but where everything ultimately came from. So even though we have good and evil, everything ultimately comes from the same source. And that source is the true God. But it's been corrupted, and we've been deceived. So this is the message of Gnosticism. There's only one reality, and it all derives from the true God. Now, of course, Orthodox Christianity, traditional Judeo-Christianity would deny this. They would say that the true God, the Creator, is totally distinct from everything else. And so the creation is not, sort of tied to him. It doesn't come from his stuff. He spoke it into existence. And so we can't look at nature as being sort of part of God. Again, pantheism, for instance, goes really well with monism and that stream of thought that Gnosticism shares, that everything in the material world somehow has God in it. Okay, a traditional Judeo-Christian worldview, traditional biblical view, would say that just isn't true. There's only one uncreated being, and the creation does not come from him in terms of any stuff. He is not in creation, and creation is not part of him. Creation is utterly distinct. It came because he decided that it exists, and that's it. None of it comes from him in an essential or stuff sense. But Gnosticism, again, denies that and takes the other view. Now, what about salvation? What is salvation to a Gnostic? Well, salvation involves the Christos coming to earth. Now, the Christos, you can obviously see that's where we get the word Christ, is one of the aeons, one of the original emanations, and a very high-ranking one. The Christos decides to come to earth and either manifest himself as a man or rest upon a man that we know as Jesus. And he does this because his mission is to help Sophia. Sophia put the little spark of divinity in all of us. Well, the Christos says, I can help fix this. I'm going to go down there and reveal the light to humans. I'm going to teach them, and I'm going to quote Ben-Hur here, that God is in every man. Okay, that's not what the Bible teaches at all, but you actually hear that in Ben-Hur, in one of the early scenes. And the Roman has Jesus teaching this. It's Gnosticism, this idea that God is in every man. Well, that's the Gnostic message. So they have the Christos, one of the eons, saying, I can help fix this. I'm going to go down there. I'm going to try to teach people who they really are so that they awaken to the fact that each one of them is divine, that the true God is really in them, and we'll see how that works out. Now, the demiurges, archons, the bad guys, the powers of darkness, manipulate humans to kill Jesus. Again, that's very similar to what the New Testament says. And once they do kill Jesus in Gnosticism, there's actually disagreement. There's some suggestion of Jesus, the man, resurrecting, but for the most part what you have is, instead of a physical bodily resurrection, you have the Christos returning to the light, returning to the pleroma alive. And so if you're, again, Gnosticism, there are variations of it, but if you're the Gnostic that says that the Christos comes to earth and manifests as a man, well, then you do have sort of a resurrection, because the Christos cannot really die. But the Christos returns to the light, to the pleroma, to the fullness, to the rest of the eons that make up the true God. Again, if he rests upon a man, well, the man's body can be in the grave, but the Christos, of course, is always alive and will ever be alive, and hopefully, accomplish the mission of dispensing revelation, getting followers, being an example of goodness and light. To those followers, so that those followers can be awakened to their own divinity. This is Gnostic salvation. So the message is gnosis. I'm telling you this so that you will want to align yourself with the light. And not only that, but you'll realize that you are the light. You are divine. You have God within you. Again, Gnostic cosmology. Now, what does this mean for Genesis? Well, a couple things, just quick observations. Genesis 1:26, let us create humankind. A Gnostic would say, well, that's the demiurge and his henchmen, the archons, participating in creating humankind because they're created to be a race of slaves. Again, very similar to ancient astronaut thinking. Genesis 3, 4 and 5, the role of the serpent. Remember the story of the serpent in Eden? When he has the conversation with Eve, the serpent said to the woman, "You will not surely die." I mean, basically he says, "Well, hey, what are you doing here?" And the woman says, "Hey, Lord God put us here and said that we can eat from everything except this one tree, and we're not even allowed to touch it," which of course God didn't say, but she adds that. And then the serpent says to her, "Look, you're not going to die. You will not surely die if you eat." God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, Elohim. You will be like the Elohim, knowing good and evil. Now look at what's happening in the Gnostic version of this. Who's God? That's the demiurge. Okay, so the serpent comes to the woman and says, "Look, I know that the demiurge told you this, that you can't eat of this tree, or else you're going to die, but that isn't true. The demiurge knows, the maker knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened. You'll have gnosis. You'll be awakened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. You're going to know who's on what side. You're going to know the story, essentially. You're going to know what you really are and what he really is." So in Gnosticism, the serpent is the hero of the story. The serpent is the one trying to enlighten Adam and Eve through this conversation. But of course, we know from the biblical account that isn't what happens, but this is the Gnostic understanding of what's going on. The Gnostics would look at what the serpent says and says, he was telling the truth, he's the hero. He's trying to help them. But the people, again, who ultimately rewrote, in their view, the story, make sure that the serpent is cast as the villain. Now, by way of conclusion, a few concluding points just to summarize Gnosticism. Gnostics believe what? Well, they believe that the true God and the divine creator of our world, the God of the Bible, are different beings. That's fundamental. They believe that evil and suffering are the fault of that creator, the demiurge, and that creator is not the true God. The true God is good. The creator, the God of the Bible, is evil. Humanity was created, but has a spark of the true God in them by means of Sophia, what she did to help us. Sophia, of course, means wisdom. They also believe that salvation for humans is not about deliverance from sin. It's about being awakened to their true divine nature. When Adam and Eve took of the apple, they weren't sinning in the Gnostic view. They were seeking enlightenment. They were getting enlightened. Again, the serpent is the hero. Now, what they did is cast by the people who, quote unquote, controlled the texts, rewrote the account. The serpent is cast as the villain, and humans are cast as, again, being the reason why the earth is just awful and we have all this suffering, but that's not the truth. The reason we have suffering is because this is the way God made it. This is the way the Maker made it. So salvation for humanity has nothing to do with this idea of redemption from sin. It has everything to do with humans being awakened to their divine nature. They need gnosis. Human destiny to a Gnostic is to return to the light. This is our destiny, to get back to the true God, the light, to return to the true source of human consciousness, to journey back into the cosmos and rejoin him. I think you can see how easy it is for science fiction to pick up on these themes. And if you have these things fixed in your mind, some of the films you've already watched, some of the TV shows you're already familiar with, you can see these threads running through them. And science fiction is just tailor-made to retell the story of Gnosticism, and it often does. So it has a connection to the cosmos. And what is that connection? Well, it's to go back into space, or to return to outer space, the greater universe where the true God is, or where the aeons are, and be connected to them, to become what they are, to be rejoined to them. And so we'll pick up these thoughts in some other videos, because there were movements even before we hit the space age. There were philosophical movements that picked up on these themes and articulated, sort of fleshed out more of the ideas that we find in today's films and novels and TV shows, science fiction, that we want to talk about on this podcast.